screencast for research assignment 3, talking about the process of how I went from interviews to codes to topics to themes. So the first thing that I did once I'd had all my interviews was start to code them. And so here's an example of one of my interviews. I had about 630 codes altogether between 3 of the interviews, and I was just coding basically key words and key topics that were coming up a lot. And so this was a time-consuming process, but was very, very crucial for the next step in the research. So once I had all my research codes, I started noticing some similarities and some trends that were coming up. And this is when I basically started to create topics from my codes. So in a Word document, I decided to start organizing my topics under headings as they were coming up. So basically, as I'm reading the interview, I start to notice things like years of teaching experience, for example, came up a few times, or the grade that the teacher was teaching. And so I started to code this under the topic of teaching experience. And other things would come up, like gender, for example. So altogether, I had about 40 different topics along the side here. And I decided to color code them based on participant, just so that in the future, if I want to know who said what specifically, I can easily go back to that interview and find out exactly what they were talking about. So there were some outliers in this process, some topics that just didn't quite tie in with my research questions or didn't really answer them, I guess. And so those were mental health education, special needs, ASD, and student families. So these were some of the topics that just didn't really fit in with the rest, so I'm going to call those ones outliers. And then I have another topic here, teacher as parent. So this was an interesting one because a few of my participants were also parents, and so at points in the interview, they did reference their role as a parent and how that impacted their views of empathy and empathy in the classroom. And so although that doesn't tie in with my research or answer any of my research questions, it is very important and interesting information, and I will likely use it in the limitations of my paper, just referencing any sort of bias that my participants may have had. Okay, so once I had finished taking all of my codes for my interviews and compiling them into this document of topics, I decided to print out this very lengthy document and lay every single piece of paper out on my floor. This is when I decided to start looking at it as one big picture. So I started just noticing themes that were popping up, some basic themes, some themes that were really obvious, and then some themes that maybe weren't so obvious. So I created, as I was noticing these things, I was just writing down basically a list of possible or potential themes. And so this list was compiled of 9 different themes. And these were very, very, very general and not specific enough to my research questions, and I knew that. So from these 9 themes, I then started condensing them a little bit more and really focusing in on the topics that I had to try to find a little bit some themes that more closely answered my research questions. So as I had those numbers going, I was sort of numbering my topics on the papers on my floor. So I was starting to number them number 3, 7, 6, and so on. And this just all started to come together until eventually every single topic, or most of the topics besides the outliers, had numbers beside them. So this made it really easy for me to see which numbers were coming up most frequently, and then I was able to sort of combine some of those rough 9 themes into one more specific one. So then looking at my research questions, my overall research question was, how are teachers implementing empathy education in the classroom to foster social-emotional development? So going down now to my final, what I condensed my 9 themes into 6, My second theme was specifically related to that overarching question, talking about the strategies that teachers use to implement and assess empathy education in the classroom. So I found a lot of great information from this. I found that teachers are making real-world connections, including the use of technology and reading the news and watching videos in the media as a way to sort of foster empathy for the world. I also found that teachers are using the arts quite frequently as a method of teaching empathy. So they were using drama and music and visual arts and all of those great things. Another theme that I got out of this was that teachers are leading a great deal of discussions about the concept of empathy with their students. And then also teachers are using literature, so read-alouds and storybooks and novels to learn about and discuss empathy with their students. And then when it comes to assessment, this was something that I knew would be kind of trickier to answer just because empathy is not a formal curriculum expectation in the curriculum document, so it's not something that teachers are reporting on per se. So in this case, the teachers are using a variety of informal assessment methods to monitor their students' empathy progress, such as observation and anecdotal notes. So that was great. Let's go back up to my research questions here. Another question that I had that I was interested to see what I would find is, does gender identity impact responses to empathy education, and if so, how? This was a bit harder for me to take the codes that I had on this and put into themes, but I managed to organize it into theme 3. So this theme is teachers referenced a variety of student factors that influence their ability to teach empathy. There wasn't enough information that I gathered on just gender alone to have its own theme. So instead, some other things came up that I wasn't necessarily expecting, and they all sort of fall under the same category of separate factors that might influence teachers. And so I was able to put gender alongside age and alongside home values. So the basic theme A here is that gender stereotypes play a role in how boys display empathy compared to girls. So teachers were well aware that the stereotypes exist. However, they were very adamant that their teaching of empathy was not influenced at all by gender or gender stereotypes, which was great. So they were aware of the stereotypes, and even one teacher actually mentioned that boys should be targeted, but they were all very unbiased in their teaching, which was great. Another thing that came up, which I wasn't really expecting, was age. So many of the teachers mentioned that age affects how they approach empathy education, talking about how they teach empathy differently towards younger students than older students, and how younger students need more empathy than older students, and older students should just have more empathy because they've had more experience on Earth, despite their view of empathy being a difficult concept for younger students. So this was a really interesting theme, and I think it fits well with the gender theme because they both are outside factors that might influence empathy teaching. And finally, the last factor here is that teachers believe that empathy is an innate skill and is mostly fostered at home, making it difficult to teach at school. So a lot of the teachers referenced cultural values and home values and just the way that a student is brought up at home, as well as the way that the student is born. They either are born with empathy or not. So there was a lot of sort of, let's put I don't want to say blame, but let's put it's students' responsibility to have empathy. Teachers have less control on how much empathy that a student has. So the life that they have at home and the way that they were brought up and the skills that they were born with innately, all of those things impact how a student is able to learn empathy. And so they were talking about how it's really difficult to, teach these things at school, and then you can't really control what they're going home to. So that was a really interesting theme that came up, and I think it fits really well with this theme. We'll have to see when I go about organizing my paper, but overall, I think my theme 3 was probably the hardest one for me to really organize and took me the longest time, but I think it works and hopefully it does in my final paper.